We sat across from each other behind the thick plexiglass. He looked so old. The fight had drained out of his eyes. We didn't talk about the case. We just stared at each other, both of us paralyzed by the absolute, crushing reality of the bureaucracy of death. When we think of horror, we usually think of a threat we can see. A masked killer, a ghost in the hallway, something supernatural that defies explanation. But the truth is, the most terrifying monsters in America don't hide in the dark. They don't carry chainsaws. They wear badges. They carry clipboards. They hide behind layers of bureaucracy, automated portals, and endless legal paperwork. The true horror of our modern society isn't that a monster wants to kill you. It's that the system built to protect you simply does not care if you die. When a massive, unfeeling bureaucracy decides you no longer have any political, legal, or economic value, you are erased. It is a slow, agonizing, invisible execution carried out by paperwork and apathy. These are not ghost stories. These are the real, human-centric nightmares of systemic abandonment. Here are 3 terrifying true stories of what happens when you fall through the cracks of the American system. Story 1. The Erasure. Buffalo, New York, in February is a brutal, unforgiving place. The wind coming off Lake Erie cuts right through your clothes, and the snow piles up so high you lose the sidewalks. My family and I live in a working-class neighborhood on the west side. For the past few months, we had been living a nightmare. My father, Nurul, had been locked up in the Erie County Holding Center. To understand why this is so horrific, you have to understand my father. He is a refugee. We fled the genocide of the Rohingya people in Myanmar. We came to America hoping for sanctuary. My father was 56 years old. He was legally blind. He couldn't read, he couldn't use a cell phone, and he didn't speak a single word of English. A year prior, he had wandered out of our apartment, got disoriented because he couldn't see, and ended up in someone's backyard using a curtain rod as a walking cane to feel his way around. The police were called. They yelled at him in a language he didn't understand. Terrified and blind, he waved the curtain rod in the air defensively. The cops tased him, tackled him, beat him, and threw him in jail for trespassing. He spent a year in a concrete cell, unable to see, unable to speak to anyone. But finally, in February 2026, his public defender worked out a plea deal. We paid his bail. My mother bought his favorite food and laid out fresh clothes. We thought our nightmare was over. We thought he was coming home. We waited outside the holding center for hours in the freezing cold. But my father never walked out those heavy metal doors. When I finally got a clerk on the phone, she sounded completely bored. She told me he had been released from county custody, but the moment he walked out, he was immediately snatched up by federal agents, Customs and Border Protection. My heart dropped into my stomach. ICE and CBP operate like a black hole. Once they take someone, they just disappear. But the reality was even stranger and infinitely more terrifying. CBP took him to a processing center. They ran his fingerprints, and the computer spit out a specific legal designation. Because he was a legal refugee, he was not amenable for removal. He couldn't be deported. To a normal human being, this means you let him go. You call his family, you call his lawyer. But to a federal bureaucracy, a human being is just a metric. If they couldn't deport him, he couldn't be used to hit a quota. He wasn't a criminal, and he wasn't an illegal immigrant. To the agents, he ceased to be a person. He became garbage. Instead of calling us, the agents loaded my blind, non-English speaking father into the back of an SUV. We spent the entire weekend calling every detention center in the state. Nobody knew where he was. The police wouldn't let us file a missing persons report right away. telling us he probably just went for a walk. It wasn't until days later, when a local reporter started pulling surveillance tapes, that we found out what the government had done to him. The CBP agents drove him 5 miles away from the jail, into the Black Rock neighborhood. They pulled up to a Tim Hortons coffee shop. Later, the agency would release a slick PR statement claiming they gave him a courtesy ride to a safe, warm location. But the security cameras told the real story. The agents pulled up at 8:18 p.m. The Tim Hortons had closed an hour earlier. The building was dark, locked, and freezing. They opened the door of the SUV. My father stepped out into the sub-zero Buffalo winter. He didn't have a winter coat. He was just wearing a thin, dark parka and khaki pants. The most horrifying detail, the one that makes me sick to my stomach every time I close my eyes, was his feet. When he was released from the jail, they didn't give him his shoes back. The agents forced a legally blind man into the snow wearing nothing but the thin, paper-like orange booties they issue to inmates. The surveillance video shows the agents driving away immediately. It shows my father, pulling his hood up, shivering violently, tapping his feet on the icy concrete. He couldn't read the signs. He couldn't see the streetlights. He wandered off into the pitch-black, freezing urban void. They threw him away like trash. For 5 days, my blind father wandered the frozen streets of Buffalo. 5 days. While people drove past him in their heated cars, assuming he was just another homeless guy. While the Department of Homeland Security sat in their warm offices. On Tuesday night, a woman walking near the hockey arena downtown, more than 5 miles from where they dumped him, called 911. She said there was a man lying on the sidewalk who wasn't breathing. She told the dispatcher his hands were gray. The paramedics tried to do chest compressions, but he was already gone. When the medical examiner released the report on April 1st, they officially ruled it a homicide. My father didn't die of natural causes. He died of hypothermia and severe dehydration, which caused a massive ulcer in his stomach to rupture. He froze and starved to death on the streets of an American city. The government refused to apologize. They called the public outrage a hoax. They claimed my father showed no signs of distress when they dropped him off, completely ignoring the fact that he was blind, couldn't speak, and was wearing paper slippers in the snow. My mother hasn't been the same since. We fled an ethnic cleansing in our home country, seeking safety. But the monsters aren't always soldiers with guns. Sometimes the monster is a federal agent who decides your life isn't worth a 5-minute phone call. The idea of a blind man being intentionally abandoned in the freezing snow by the people who are supposed to process him is a level of cruelty that is hard to even process. I have to ask you guys, do you think the agents involved in something like that should face murder charges, or is the system itself to blame? Drop a comment and tell me what you think, because I read every single one. While you're down there, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to Creepy Digest. It tells the algorithm to push these crucial stories out to more people. Now, let's get into our second story and find out what really happens behind the locked doors of state-funded group homes. Story 2. The Black Site of Care. When you have a family member with severe, profound disabilities, the exhaustion is total. My younger brother, David, is nonverbal and intellectually disabled. He requires round-the-clock care. He can't feed himself, he can't bathe himself, and he has the cognitive capacity of a toddler in a grown man's body. For years, my mother and I took care of him. But when my mother got sick, we realized we couldn't do it anymore. We made the agonizing decision to place him in a state-funded, privately run group home. We chose a facility run by a massive corporate provider called Support Solutions in Greenville, Tennessee. The brochures were beautiful. They promised a happy, healthy, and safe environment, They received millions of dollars in federal Medicare and state funding. We thought he would be safe. We thought professionals would be watching him. We didn't realize we were dropping him into a privatized black site. Because David is nonverbal, he can't tell you if someone is hurting him. You have to learn to read his body language. After about 6 months at the Greenville facility, David started changing. He was always a happy, bouncy guy. But when I would visit him on Sundays, he started cowering when the staff walked into the room. If a male caregiver raised his voice, even slightly, David would immediately curl into a tight ball on the floor and cover his head. I started noticing strange bruises, a dark purple ring around his upper arm, like someone had grabbed him violently, a scrape on his cheek. When I asked the facility manager, she always had a smooth, rehearsed answer. Oh, he had a rough night and bumped into his bed frame. He slipped in the shower. We filled out an incident report. I wanted to believe them. The psychological guilt of placing a family member in a home is so heavy, you desperately want to believe the professionals are telling the truth. But then, the news broke in May of 2025. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation raided the exact facility my brother was living in. 6 employees were indicted and arrested. The charges were horrifying. Aggravated neglect of a vulnerable adult. Abuse of a vulnerable adult. I panicked. I rushed to the facility to pull David out, but the corporate management assured all the families that the bad apples had been removed. The state was monitoring them, and new, rigorous protocols were in place. We couldn't afford a private nurse at home, so, foolishly, I left him there. The problem with these corporate group homes is that they operate behind closed doors, entirely funded by the state, with almost zero unannounced oversight. The caregivers realize very quickly that their victims literally cannot speak. They can't testify in court. They can't call 911. It is the ultimate power imbalance. In March of 2026, I got a call from Adult Protective Services. The investigator's voice was completely flat. The way people sound when they deal with trauma every single day. She told me they had received a credible tip and had placed hidden cameras in the facility. What they caught on tape was pure evil. A 33-year-old caregiver named Akeem Jenret had been assigned to my brother's unit. The tapes showed Jenret systematically torturing David. It wasn't just neglect. It was active, sadistic abuse. When David couldn't understand a command to move quickly enough, Jenret would strike him. The tapes showed him aggressively shoving my nonverbal brother against walls, screaming in his face, and intentionally withholding food as a punishment for bad behavior. My brother was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't describe. He was locked in a house with a monster, and every time the monster hurt him, the state of Tennessee wrote a check to the corporation that hired him. Akeem Jenret was indicted by a grand jury and arrested on multiple counts of abuse and neglect. He bonded out of jail for $35,000. But the true horror isn't Jenret. It's the system itself. When I looked into the public records, I found out the Greenville facility had an endless history of this. A year before the mass arrests in 2025, 2 other employees had been indicted for the exact same thing. It wasn't a case of a few bad apples. The corporation had built a culture of institutionalized violence. They paid their workers minimum wage, provided zero psychological screening, and warehoused the most vulnerable people in our society out of public view. The state pays these private equity firms millions of dollars just to keep disabled people out of sight. I pulled David out of the facility the day I got the call. I quit my job, and we live in poverty now so I can watch him 24/7. But every time I drive past one of those unassuming, normal-looking suburban group homes, I shudder. Because I know that behind those locked doors, someone who can't speak is screaming in the dark, and the system is paying the person hurting them. Story 3, The Waiting Room. There is a very specific kind of psychological torture that only the American legal system can inflict. If someone puts a gun to your head, the terror is immediate. But if the state tells you they are going to kill you and then makes you sit in a concrete box for 30 years waiting for it to happen, the terror becomes your entire existence. My father's name was Charles Sonny Burton Jr. To me, he was just Dad. To the state of Alabama, he was an inmate on death row at the Holman Correctional Facility. Let me be perfectly clear. My father was not an angel in his younger years. In 1991, he got involved with a bad crew. They planned to rob an AutoZone store in Talladega. My father was the getaway driver. He walked into the store, got cold feet, turned around, and walked back out to the car. He was physically outside the building when the horrific tragedy happened. Inside the store, one of the other guys, a man named Derek DeBruce, panicked and shot a customer named Doug Battle, killing him instantly. It was a tragedy. But the facts of the case were never in dispute. The prosecutor, the judge, and the jury all acknowledged that my father did not pull the trigger. He wasn't even in the room. But Alabama has a deeply draconian law called felony murder. It means that if you are involved in a crime and someone dies, you can be charged with capital murder, even if you had no intent to kill and didn't participate in the violence. The horrific realization of how the justice system actually works hit our family during the sentencing. The guy who actually pulled the trigger, Derek DeBruce, was sentenced to death, but later had his sentence reduced to life in prison because of a technicality with his lawyer. The other accomplices got 25 years. But my father, a black man in Alabama who never shot anyone, the state sentenced him to death. He became the only person involved in the crime marked for execution. For 35 years, my father lived in a 6 by 9 foot cell on death row. Can you imagine the psychological weight of that? Over 10,000 days, waking up every morning knowing that the state has a scheduled date to strap you to a gurney and end your life for a murder they know you didn't commit. It destroyed our family. My entire life became a crusade to save him. I organized protests outside the governor's mansion with a bullhorn. I collected 67,000 signatures begging for clemency. I put my entire life on hold. I decided not to have children because I couldn't bear the thought of bringing a child into a world where the government was going to execute their grandfather for no reason. The terror peaked in early 2026. The state of Alabama officially scheduled his execution date. And they weren't going to use lethal injection. They were going to use a new, highly experimental method: fatal nitrogen gas asphyxiation. They were going to suffocate him to death with a mask. I visited him a week before the date. We sat across from each other behind the thick plexiglass. He looked so old. The fight had drained out of his eyes. We didn't talk about the case. We just stared at each other, both of us paralyzed by the absolute, crushing reality of the bureaucracy of death. The most bitter pill I ever had to swallow happened the same month. A man named Larry Green, the guy who had brutally stabbed my own mother to death in 1988, was granted medical parole by the state and released from prison. The state let the man who murdered my mother go free while they prepared the gas chamber for my father, who had never taken a life. That is the American justice system. It came down to the absolute wire. 48 hours before they were scheduled to put the mask on his face, my phone rang. It was my father's lawyer. Governor Kay Ivey had abruptly stepped in. She commuted his death sentence to life without the possibility of parole. She issued a statement saying she couldn't in good conscience execute my father when the guy who actually pulled the trigger was still alive in general population. I collapsed on my living room floor and sobbed until I couldn't breathe. It was the happiest day of my life. When I visited him the next day, I could finally press my hand against the glass and know it wasn't the last time I would see him alive. But the trauma doesn't just wash away. The state of Alabama held my father hostage in the shadow of the execution chamber for 3 decades based on a procedural technicality. They tortured our family for 30 years. The death penalty isn't a precise instrument of justice. It is a massive, blind, terrifying machine. And once it locks onto you, it operates with a profound, terrifying indifference to the truth. If you take anything away from these stories, let it be this. The system isn't broken. It is operating exactly how it was designed to. When human beings are reduced to case numbers, the concept of justice is just an illusion. Before you go, drop a comment and tell me, which of these 3 systemic nightmares terrified you the most? Have you ever had a sketchy encounter where you realized the system didn't care about you? Sound off below. Let's get a discussion going. If you have your own true terrifying encounters with bureaucratic horror, bad cops, or the dark side of your city, please send them to the email in the description below. Don't forget to drop a like and subscribe to Creepy Digest so you never miss an upload. Sleep well, and thanks for watching.